Kutin. I was born Audrey Schneiderman. My parents were Rita and Annette Schneiderman. Years later, my father changed his name to Nat Schneider for business reasons. So when I was in college, I was known as Audrey Schneider. I met my husband George when I was a junior in college. He was in dental school. We got married the following year. I started teaching in Queens. Together, we used our wedding money to pay for his last year of dental school. He graduated in 65. We got married in 64. He graduated dental school in 65. It was during the height of the Vietnam War. So he went in under something called the Berry Plan, where he went in as a captain. And we went down to Fort Sam in Texas for his basic training. And then we were stationed at Fort Hood, which was in Killeen, Texas. And it was an armored division. And there he worked at the dental clinic. He worked not on the troops, though. He worked on the dependents. And while he was working on the dependents, he decided that he really, truly enjoyed working with children. And so while he was there, he applied to various dental schools to become a pedodontist. And so after the Army, we went up to Rochester, New York, and he was at the Eastman Dental Center for 2 years. And then we came down here to Bayshore, and he set up practice on Brentwood Road. And he was a children's dentist, a pedodontist in the professional building on Brentwood Road and Main Street until this past September when he retired. When we were in the service, I had my first daughter, Ellen Stacy, so she was born in Texas. Then in Rochester, I had my second daughter, Stephanie, and she was, again, born in Rochester. And then my third daughter was born right down here in Southside Hospital. And
I'm going to ask you to go back and tell us when you were born and where you grew up and some of your, don't forget your mom's maiden name. I want to know that.
Okay. My mom's maiden name was Rita Friedman, and I was born in the Bronx in 1942. My dad went into the service. He was stationed in Biloxi, Mississippi. Now, he was deferred because he had a child, but while he was down in Biloxi, they declared the armistice. However, they still sent him over, so he served in peacetime Germany. And then when he came back, my parents took an apartment in Stuyvesant Town. So we lived in Stuyvesant Town for 18 months. My brother was born there. He was the first baby to be born in his building. And then from there, we moved, when I was in third grade, we moved out to Oceanside, and I went to school in Oceanside. It was a wonderful, wonderful place to grow up, Oceanside, at that time. And I've been to all my reunions. Every 10 years we have a reunion. So
what schools in Oceanside did you?
Well, I went to Oaks number 3, and then I went to the junior high, and then there was the senior high.
Public school, part of the public school.
Yes. And one of my highlights, when I was in 12th grade or 11th grade, I won the Unity and Brotherhood Award. When I had to write for the newspaper, I had to write, it was a contest, and we had to go to the library, and everybody had to write in the library under the teacher's supervision. And my theme was, united we stand, divided we fall. Anyway, I won, and I got a $25 bond. To this day, now this was it was probably 1958 or 59. I still have that $25 bond. Another bond I have is when we went up to Rochester. I entered a writing contest for the newspaper up there, and it was on being pregnant and belonging to the Y. And again, I won, and they came and they took my picture, and I was in the newspaper, and I got another $25 bond, and I still have that one also. So I'm sure if I ever run out of money, those two $25 bonds will certainly see me through.
Now, you have 3 girls.
Yes.
You told us. How are they different?
Oh my goodness. Well, my oldest daughter, Ellen, is a kindergarten teacher in Queens, and she's still single, but she has a house, a townhouse in Oakdale. My second daughter, Stephanie, just got married in May. So I had a very, very busy, hectic first year of retirement because I was planning this wedding. And she is a school psychologist. She worked for the city of New York. All she does is work on impartial. She runs the team for the special ed department. And this past year, she was hired by Scarsdale. So she works now in Scarsdale. And her husband works in real estate in Manhattan, and they live in Manhattan. And she's a doctor. Yeah, she's Dr. Stephanie, and she got her doctorate at Yeshiva. She went to Queens as I did, and then she went to Yeshiva and got her doctorate there, her PhD. And my youngest daughter, Shelley, she teaches social studies in Freeport. All my girls followed in my footsteps. So and her husband works for LIPA. They live here in Bayshore. They bought her husband's house. She married a Bayshore boy, and they bought her parents' house, his parents' house. So they live in Bayshore, and they have two of the most gorgeous, gorgeous little boys. My Ryan is 3 years old, and Ethan is a year. And they are the light of my life, and I adore them. And
Ryan and Ethan, too young yet to have demonstrated some family talent or traits that you see beginning to emerge?
Yes, Ryan lives with his golf club in his hand. My husband and I and his father all play golf. And Ryan, his father got him cut down clubs. We were out, in fact, this past weekend, we went out to Mattituck. My mother was one of 4 sisters. And one of my cousins built a beautiful house out in Mattituck. So he had a family reunion. So all my first cousins and second cousins, and now my 2 little grandsons of the 3rd generation. And he has a putting green out there. And my little Ryan did not leave that putting green. Every once in a while he jumped in the pool, but then he'd come right out again and he'd stand there. I mean, he's just unbelievable. And he really, with these little clubs at 3 years old, he can really, really wallop. And little Ethan, even though he's only a year, he follows his big brother. So he brings the club with him also. And of course, he doesn't have the eye-hand coordination, but yes, those traits are definitely from the family.
What are some of the earliest memories that you have as a child?
Some of my earliest memories. Well, my brother Larry is 7 years younger than I am. And he was out at this reunion this past weekend. We're very close, very, very close. And he was talking about how being 7 years younger than me, when we used to take these family trips down to Washington and things like that, they would take pictures. My father would take the movie camera, and can see my brother running in and out, waving and bothering me and teasing me. And to this day, I mean, he adores my daughters. My brother doesn't have any children, so my 3 daughters he's very close to them. And he teases them the same way he used to tease me. He pinches their cheeks, but he's a wonderful, wonderful uncle to them.
And what does your brother do? What is it?
Oh, my brother works for R.O.B.S Polls, and he runs the phone centers throughout the country for the polls.
On your mother's side, are you aware of the family history? Do you know anything about the background of the family?
Well, my grandmother came from Russia, someplace in Russia, maybe Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, one of those 3. I know she used to tell me stories about the wolves, and she used to always make clay. We used to play and make clay figurines for me. Whenever I played with my grandmother, we would take out the clay and play with clay. She lived, as I said, my mother was one of 4 sisters. So my grandmother was widowed as a young woman, and she raised these 4 girls by herself. They had a candy store, and each of the sisters worked in the candy store, a stationery store, and each married. So the last to marry was my Aunt Bess, who lived in Rockville Center, and I lived in Oceanside. So my grandmother moved in with my Aunt Bess in Rockville Center, so I was able to see my grandmother frequently because we did live so close together.
How old was your grandmother when she arrived here?
I don't know. She married her cousin, Harry. Her name was Etta, and my daughter Ellen is named for her. Etta, in the Jewish religion, we named for for people who have passed on. So Ellen is Ellen Stacy. So it was my grandmother and my husband's grandmother Cecilia, and then Stephanie is named for George's, my husband's also grandmother, and then Stephanie Lynn, and the Lynn is for my Aunt Bess's husband Lou, and then Shelley is named for, I think, my husband's husband. Isn't that funny? I can't remember now.
I didn't ask you who you were named.
Oh, I was named for my two grandfathers. Audrey was for Abraham, my father's father, and they gave me a middle name, H, for Harry, my mother's father, because my name was Audrey Schneiderman, and my mother felt it was just too big to for a little girl to have to say a middle name. So as I grew up, instead of saying just H, I always say that my name is Honey. And in fact, if you don't, somehow Honey is usually in my email addresses and, things like that. Or not my email addresses, my, little codes.
Yes.
I usually use Honey.
Yeah. Did your grandmother arrived at probably the first part of the century?
Yes. Yeah. And they lived in Manhattan. And my mother went to Washington Irving High School. And
what are some of the memories you have of your mother as a little girl, as you being a little girl? How do you remember?
Oh, my mother was wonderful. Everybody loved my mother. And she loved to sing, had a terrible voice. When my mother was pregnant with me, she had cancer of the throat. It was diagnosed by the dentist. It was a sarcoma of some sort at the back of her throat. And they wanted to abort me. And this was, as I said, in 1941, because I was born in 42. They had just come out with radiation. So my grandmother said to her, this was my father's mother, said to her, oh, by the way, my father's mother worked in the leather industry. And when I was a little girl, she used to always make me these wonderful leather and suede coats. And she also was widowed young, raised two sons by herself. Anyway, what was I saying? I forgot where I was now.
You were talking about your grandmother who made you leather.
She made me. Oh, so she said to my mother to go to a doctor in Manhattan. So my mother went to the doctor in Manhattan, and they said that they would try radiation. And so through her entire pregnancy, she used to go, now I don't know if it was once a week or once a month or every other week, but she used to have these needles, 40 needles put into her throat. And then they would do, whatever the burst was. So my mother always had, her neck it looked burned. I mean, it didn't look like third-degree burns, but it was always darker. And she also had a very bad, her voice would get very raspy. And as she grew older, she would occasionally develop, her vocal cords when she was in her 60s, it started, her vocal cords would get paralyzed. And this is all from the radiation. She also developed bad spinal problems. She had a couple of disc operations. And my mother died from pneumonia because she had lost the ability to swallow. And she was 78. And they had put her on Ensure, which was a supplement. And she drank it and she inhaled it and she developed pneumonia. And that's what she died from. So even though her heart was strong, but it didn't matter. My mother was absolutely the most wonderful, wonderful person. My father died when he was 58, and they were the same age. And she had a companion for many years named Maxie. So he was a very nice man, and he went to all my daughter's bat mitzvahs, and he's in all the family albums. And then she kicked him out for various reasons. So anyway,
how did your mother and father meet? Do you know that?
Yes. They worked. Both parents were during the Depression, and they worked for a knitting company called Upjohn. And my father was the shipping clerk, and my mother came in, and she used to, and they were both very bright people, but in those days, nobody went to college. I mean, few people could go to college. So whatever she did, something with the bobbin or whatever. Anyway, um, since he was the shipping clerk, he would always have to pick up whatever she had, the finished product. And so um, she always tells the story that he used to wink at her, and it wasn't for a long time that she realized he had a twitch, but she thought he was flirting. Anyway, he lived in Brooklyn, she lived in Manhattan, and after about 7 years, they got married, and they lived in the Bronx, 1236 Virginia Avenue, and that's where I was born. And
tell us about your dad.
My dad was a wonderful man also. He, again, loved to sing. His two favorite songs were Night and Day and Temptation. You came, I was alone. And he had one brother, Sid. They were 11 years apart. And his brother, when his brother Sid got married to my Aunt Judy, I was their flower girl. When George and I got married, their daughter Ellen Mindy was my flower girl. They live in Florida now, my aunt and uncle, and I see them frequently. In fact, years ago, we went to Cancun together to a Club Med. So, because he married a woman who was 10 years younger than he. So she and I, not that we were contemporaries, but we became and still are friends, even though,
Was it just you and your brother?
Yes, yes.
What did you learn from him?
From my brother?
What did he teach you?
Oh, my brother taught me that I was the most beautiful, wonderful person in the whole world. And to this day, he still, every time he sees me, he says, "Oh, you're so slim. You look so young." I mean, he really makes me feel good. And that's what my father did also. He also made me feel very, very, my father worked for Zenith, by the way. My father was a sales manager for Zenith, the Zenith in Manhattan in the showroom. And he had some big accounts. Cy Sims was one of his accounts, and a place in New Jersey called Masters, but he died of heart failure when he was very young. Well, 58.
Now, you were fortunate in that you knew all your grandparents?
No. I only knew my two grandmothers.
Your grandmothers?
Yes, I didn't meet. That's why I was named after my two grandfathers.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Can you point to something that you learned from each of your grandmothers?
Well, as I said, my mother's mother was the one who lived in Rockville Center. And from her, I learned how, I don't know, it's very hard to say, just how to be there, how to be reliable, how to be dependent. She always used to read the Jewish newspaper, the Forvitz. They called it the Forvitz. And she used to tell me stories. She used to babysit for me because we were in Oceanside. She was in Rockville Center. My other grandmother, as I said, went to work for the leather industry, leather and suede. And from her, I think I certainly learned the value of working. Absolutely. She would take the subway. She worked until she was 80 years old. She lied, about her age so that they could continue.
She must have looked younger too.
Yes. Yeah. Both. Yeah.
Among adult influences outside of the family, who would you say had the greatest impact on you during your formative years?
Outside of my family.
Outside of your immediate family, were there friends? Were there other relatives? Or...
As I said, I was very close with my mother's four sisters.
Okay.
Her older sister, Helen and Irving, lived in Brooklyn and then moved to Texas, to Dallas. He worked for Van Cleef and Arpels, and they opened up a store in Dallas. So when my husband and I were stationed in Texas, at Killeen, Texas, they became our family, and we spent all the holidays going up to Dallas to visit them. My mother's other sister, Bess, lived in Rockville Center. She also ran her own business. She had a company called Hormel, which her daughter and son-in-law now have taken over. And all my aunts just made me feel that I was the first granddaughter. I had two older cousins, but not that much older. But in any case, my aunts just made me feel that I was just so special and so wonderful. And my mother's third sister, Evelyn, lived in Florida, and she just passed away in the past 2 years. It was her son that made this wonderful party out in Mattituck over the weekend. And when we were in Florida, every time I'd go down to visit my mother, I mean, we always spent time with my aunt and uncle. And I guess those are my most influential people, my aunts and uncles.
Yes.
Yeah.
I want to know, how old were you, or at what point in your life did you know what your career path was going to be? And is there one person more than any other that influenced that decision on your part?
Well, I think I always knew I was going to be a teacher. As a little girl in elementary school, we always played school. And then my father's wife, my father's brother, Sid, his wife, Judy, was an elementary school teacher. And so I used to listen to her stories. But at one point, I did want to become a librarian. And my mother said to me, "Why would you want to be a librarian?" She says, "All they do is put books on shelves." Of course, in those days, maybe that's all they did do. Of course, now, and I still, to this day, I adore the library. I love reading. And my second home is the library. The minute we went down to Florida this past winter, I joined the library. And I have to be near a library. I never buy books.
Audrey, what was your first paying job?
My first paying job. Oh, well, I used to work for the summers. I used to go away to camp as a camp counselor. So when I was about 16, my parents lied about my age. And my brother went as the camper. So I guess that was the motivation. So I was at 16, a counselor to girls who must have been 10 or 12 years old. And pretty much those were my only jobs. Camp, later a hotel counselor. But basically, those were the only jobs I had.
Was there one family holiday that was the big holiday in the course of a year?
Well, being Jewish, Rosh Hashanah has always been a big holiday, and we would always celebrate it growing up, we would celebrate it with my mother and, go over to my aunt's house. We'd go to temple. We belonged to the not the Bayshore, the Oceanside Jewish Center. And so we would go to services, and then we would go to my aunt's house in Rockville Center for dinner. She had a big, big round table, and you could sit easily 15 people at this round table. So we would always have a wonderful dinner there. And now that I'm married, my husband has a brother and a sister. And his sister lives in Nassau County, and his brother lives here in Comac. And we spend every vacation, we used to spend every vacation together too. But when the kids were growing up, we would go every Christmas. We would get together because his brother and sister were everybody was teachers, including myself later on. And so we would go places for Christmas with all our children. So we went to Paradise Island, and we went to St. Martin, and we went to Florida when his parents moved to Florida. And we would get 4 apartments, or condos or something. And so the first cousins would share rooms, and then we each would have a room. So anyway, but we would spend every holiday together. So Rosh Hashanahs would be at my sister-in-law Toby's house in Nassau. And then Thanksgiving would either be at my house or at my sister-in-law in Comac. And then whoever had Thanksgiving, then the other one would have Passover. So
here's 3 quick questions.
Okay.
Are you a morning person or a night person?
Oh, definitely morning. Okay. Definitely.
Did you have a favorite toy growing up at any stage that you remember?
No.
Okay.
Only my books.
Okay. Favorite season?
Favorite season? Oh, spring. Because my birthday's in May.
Is there an aroma that means family to you?
Yes, lilacs. When we lived in Rochester, there was a Highland Park, and they in the spring they always had millions, but thousands and thousands of lilac bushes. And my daughter Stephanie was born in March. And that first spring in May, I remember taking Ellen, who was now 2 years old, and Stephanie in her carriage. And we went to this Highland Park. And every time I smell lilacs, I remember when my babies were babies.
Your favorite subjects in school and your least favorite subjects?
Oh, well, English and history were my favorite subjects, and math and science were my least favorite.
Mm-hmm.
And my last 2 years at Brentwood High School, I ended up teaching. I taught special ed, but I ended up teaching English and American history. So those were my two best teaching years.
You mentioned leaving Brentwood. Now that brings us perfect segue to ask you what year you came to Brentwood and why Brentwood?
Okay, well, I think, it's funny. I can't remember what year. I put in 19 years. So it has to be, I assume, 83. And what had happened was I had retired I only taught for 2 years. I taught 1 year in the city and then 1 year in Texas. And then I had raised my children. And in the 70s, when I had decided to go back to teaching, they weren't hiring. So they said the only people who were being hired were special ed teachers. So I went to Post and I got the degree in special ed and reading. And I got a job working. I was teaching a CETA program out at the Selden campus in Brentwood. The Selden campus, yeah, the Suffolk community, yes. So I did that for 2 years, and I was hired as an adjunct. And then the funding was stopped for that, and I went and I got a position as I was teaching reading, by the way, because I had the dual certification. And then I worked in Great Neck just as a 3-month leave replacement. And then the next year, what they wanted to give me was 5 mornings in the junior high. Again, it was a Title I program. And it was just too much to get to Great Neck so early in the morning. I still had young children to get off to school, and it was still only a 3-hour job, so it wasn't worth it. So I was floundering. And I went to a party, my sister-in-law in Comac, and Carol Quitkin, who worked in the junior high, an English teacher in the junior high, said that she had just seen posted a reading position in Brentwood. And I called up and I spoke to Dave Holt, and he said that it was at St. Anne's. Now, here I was, this, nice Jewish girl, but he said that was okay. So I went over and I met Sister Stephen, and she and Dave interviewed me, and they hired me. And I worked as a Title I teacher at St. Anne's for a year and a half. And then the Supreme Court came in and said, you cannot have public school teachers teaching in private schools. So they moved me over to the KFC hall, which was across the parking lot. And all day long, the students came back and forth. We had a lot of aides, and the aides were bringing the kids back and forth and back and forth. Meanwhile, I had started taking courses already, SEPTA courses, and Howard Brodsky was one of my instructors. And we struck up a friendship. And I approached him and I said, I'm not happy in my reading position. Are there any openings in special ed? So this was in January, and he said that they have an overflow for the resource room starting in February, and that if I wanted, I could come and work for him in the resource room as an overflow teacher in 2 buildings. So I went to, I think it was Southwest and Hemlock. I think that's what I did. And I worked, half day in each position. And then came the spring, and Howard says to me, Audrey, he says, we don't have any more overflow. I can't use you as a resource room teacher. I will give you, though, a self-contained. So he gave me a self-contained class in Loretta Park with Andy Levito as my principal. And I walked in and they had just set up this class. And when you first started special ed in Brentwood, you didn't have any materials. Nowadays, they really do. I mean, nowadays we get materials. I had nothing, nothing. And I had 12 students. And the way they had set up the class, I probably had the least, quote, desirable students. I mean, they were tough. They were tough. And I had never really taught self-contained. I mean, I did a little student teaching way back at CW Post, but all my other positions, Great Neck and Suffolk Community and even the resource room, I would come home now this is the new teachers. I would come home every night and cry. I was in my 40s and I would cry and I'd get up in the morning and I'd say, I can't go. I can't face it. I can't face it. And one day my husband said to me, then quit. And then he says, you know what? Ellen's starting college in 2 years. We need the money. And he kicks me out of bed. Well, anyway, by Thanksgiving, I think I had things under control. I mean, I had gone and I spoke to Bob Brodsky, Bob Bronzo, and he gave me like a pep talk. And of course, Andy Levito was really terrific. He understood perfectly what I was going through.
You never really had an interview formally. You talked to Dave Holt. You spoke. Howard Brodsky kind of took you under his wing.
Exactly.
And so it was a transition.
Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. Absolutely. Anyway, by Thanksgiving, things were under control. And 19 years later, I was still teaching self-contained.
What were the first impressions you had of the district when you began your work?
Well, just that the staff was great. I worked next door to a girl named Sally Karp, who we became very good friends. We used to golf together. And just that the teachers themselves were all very, very supportive. And that the kids were rough or tough, that they were very poor and that I was not going to get much cooperation from the parents. And I guess those were my and they were very good to me. The fact that, as I said, they let me work at St. Anne's and then, yes, Yes.
You had plenty of freedom in Brentwood, that's right.
Yes, absolutely.
You mentioned self-contained. You were still with self-contained by the end. Did you do any other things during how many years?
19 years. Well, I worked for 5 years there at Loretta Park, always in self-contained. And then they started the middle school concept. So Howard called me into his office and he said to me, we are moving you up to the middle school and you'll be having a sixth grade self-contained class up in the middle school. And I remember saying to him, Howard, where am I going to get all my hugs and kisses in the middle school? Because one thing about the students that I had, they were always extremely affectionate. And, it's very nurturing to have that kind of, I don't know, maybe with special ed kids, they're a little more, whatever. So I remember saying to him, where am I going to get my stroking? That's what it was. Not so much the hugs and kisses, my stroking. He says, believe me, you'll get your stroking. So they sent me up to South Middle. And again, here I was, a completely new situation. I had never taught in a middle school. And it was very interesting because it was a whole new concept. And the kids would, was set up into the 7 or 8 periods. So the first period of the day, let's say I had math. And then the bell would ring and the kids would go out in the hall and they'd come back in and then I'd have English. And then the bell would ring and the kids would come back in and I'd have social studies. And then the bell would ring and they'd come back in and I'd do science. So I did the entire curriculum. However, what was very interesting is each time they came back in, they sat in different seats. So it was as if they were in different rooms. So it was challenging. I became very friendly with Miriam Couch. And she and I, and Ellen Bresloff also was a new teacher to the building. And we also became very friendly. And then, anyway, so I was there for 5 years. And again, loved it. in every situation that I go into, I find challenging at the beginning, and then I learn the ropes, and then I learn to love it.
Which leads me to ask you this question. You had a job description in what you were doing formally, but you also had a purpose which you brought with you. Have you ever defined for yourself what your purpose in getting up every morning and coming in and doing what you did?
What my purpose was?
How did you see that? What was your?
Well, it gave me a very full life, an extremely full life. First of all, I defined myself as as a teacher. And every time I would meet new people, first of all, and again, the children that I taught, they themselves had so many issues that I could regale people with conversations about my students for hours. But I mean, that wasn't the purpose. But these children, I don't know, they just needed so much. They just needed so much. And I really loved having a purpose of going to work. I loved it. I loved it.
What was the most difficult thing you ever had to do in your life?
Aside from burying my parents, I think that was probably the most difficult. Yes, yes.
Have you always, or were you a member of the Brentwood Teachers Association during all these years?
I paid my dues, but I was never active.
Okay, all right. Well, you're a member of the retirees of Brentwood Schools now.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. And I've been going to the meetings and enjoying them.
Was there, during the time that you were actively teaching, was there ever an occurrence that the organization got involved with that impacted you that stands out in your mind? Some kind of an incident or something that was happening in the district. Howard Brodsky was always a controversial figure in the district anyway. You obviously had a good relationship.
Very good. Very good.
But was there something else that was going on that you remember?
Oh, yeah. After 5 years in the middle school, as you know, Howard Brodsky loved moving people around. So for whatever reason, I never found out why, they decided to send me back to the elementary school. And they sent me over to, I think it was to Oak Park. And at Oak Park, they put us out in the portables. And when I questioned why I was transferred, Bob Bronzo said to me, because we need some experienced hands down there. And sure enough, into the portables came 3 brand new teachers. I mean, they weren't 25-year-old brand new teachers. They were women who had worked as aides, women who had been around, but they were still brand new teachers. Unfortunately, the principal and I'd always gotten along well with the principals. Marianne, I don't even remember what her last name was, but she did not like me, and I don't know why. And she had a volatile temper, and she used to scream at me for what I consider minor, quote, infractions. Here we were out in the portables. Every time the kids had to go to the bathroom, we had to take them into the building, put on their hats, their coats, in the rain, the boots, just to go to the bathroom, just to go to lunch, just to go to gym, just to go to music. Everything was in the building. I got pneumonia twice my first year because I would just run out without putting on my coat. Anyway, Marianne, for whatever reason, really did not like me. And the union rep in my building had overheard one of her tirades against me. And she came to me and she said, Audrey, never, ever go into her office again without me. And anyway, after 2 years, I went to Howard. That was Howard's retiring year. And I said to him, Howard, I'm really having a rough time over there. Would you send me to the high school? And he said yes. So he sent me up to the high school, and I spent 5 years in the high school. So that was one incident with the union. My other incident with the union was that when I was getting ready to retire. Now, I was over 55 because I had started much later. And of course, I knew about all the incentives for 55-year-olds. Well, I heard that if you retire at 20 years, then you also get an incentive. So counting my 19 years in Brentwood and my 1 year in New York City, I was going to have 20 years. And I went over to personnel, and they said they would look into it. And they came back and they said, no, it's got to be 20 years in Brentwood. But the contract did not read 20 years in Brentwood. So I went to the head of the union, and he stepped in, and I was able to get the incentive. So that was a very positive.
What was the date of your actual retirement?
I retired in, July 1st of 03. Yes.
Now, Audrey, is there something that you can identify as a source of your greatest professional accomplishment? Is there one thing or one memory associated with something you were really proud of?
Yes, my last year here at the high school. As I said, they had put me. I was teaching the two American history classes, and the students now had to take Regents. This was the first year that they had to take Regents, and it was very, very, very difficult. In order to teach these students, I had to read to them most of the material because they were still very, most of them had fifth or sixth grade. The good readers had fifth or sixth grade reading abilities. I did have a few dyslexia children who never learned how to read. Anyway, came the Regents, and I'm trying to remember, out of my 30 students in my two sections, 15 each, 15 came in to take the Regents. 5 passed the Regents, and 1 passed the RCT. Now, to me, this was a tremendous accomplishment because those history Regents, they had to write essays. They had to, I read them every short answer. I read them all the questions, and I read them all the essays, and we stayed for hours and hours. They were allowed unlimited time. So we stayed for hours and hours. But to me, the fact that I consider it a third, because 15 came in, 5 passed, I consider a third of my students pay. And to me, that was my greatest teaching accomplishment.
Why did you decide that it was time to retire?
Okay. Why did I decide? I didn't. My husband decided. My husband has been a children's dentist in Bay Shore for 30 years, and he'd had it. It's very difficult to be a children's dentist. The insurance companies are driving you crazy. Mainly the insurance companies are driving you crazy. And he was not the kind of person to retire and just sit at home. He wanted to go to Florida, and he wanted me with him. And so I had reached because I had gotten back, I was in tier 1. I came back in tier 4, but then we were legislated back into tier 1. So I already had now the 20 years in because I had the 1 year in the city and the 19 years in Brentwood, and I was way over the 55 limit. I was 61. And so, and he was 63. And so,
have you been traveling since?
Tremendously. Yes. Okay. Since we retired, we've hit almost a dozen national parks. The first summer, we flew out to Montana and we went to Glacier National Park. And then we went up to Canada and we went to Lake Louise and Banff and Jasper. And then in the fall, we came home and we went down to the Shenandoah National Park. But we were evacuated because it was, there was a hurricane. But we still got to spend 2 days in the park. While we were down there, we went to Monticello, to Jefferson's home. And I had been there when I was 10 years old, so it was quite a difference to go back now that I was in my 60s. And then this past year, then we spent the winter in Florida at this apartment that I had inherited from my mom. And then this past summer, we just went out to Colorado, and we started in Mesa Verde, and we loved the cliff dwellings. And then we went up to Rocky Mountain National Park and did hiking and biking. And
what's on your to-do list?
Well, right now, we just bought a place in Boca down in Florida. And I came home in April and from Florida, and my daughter got married in May. And as soon as her wedding was over, we put the house on the market. We sold the house in 3 weeks. So right now I'm in the process of packing and packing, and we'll be probably moving in October. But I do hope to be able to come back in the spring and rent a place so that I can be with my family and grandchildren and friends.
You mentioned, Audrey, that your love affair with books.
Yes.
Is there one book that stands out in your mind as being one of the most important books you've ever read?
One of the most important books I've ever read.
You can't. That's a tough question.
Stones in the River was wonderful, and that was about a dwarf in Germany. And what else? I remember when we went to Italy many years ago, I read Agony and the Ecstasy, which was the story of Michelangelo. And we went with another couple. And as we were walking through Rome, I kept saying, come, we have to go into this church to see this statue. And we have to, of course, go to Florence to see David. And my girlfriend was so impressed that I knew so much about Michelangelo and where all his statues were. And it was, finally I told her I had just finished reading Agony and the Ecstasy. But as for a favorite book, probably not.
Was there something that you would like to have accomplished while you were working that you never were able to see concluded? Something that you wanted to do that you couldn't accomplish in the time you had?
Well, these poor, these unfortunate young, students who never learned how to read. When I was down in the elementary school, that's all we worked on. And I'd have 3 and 4 reading groups and 2 and 3 math groups. But once you got up to the high school, even though I had I always taught a reading section, but mostly it was for comprehension. It no longer was for, phonics. And I just feel badly that there are still so many students who can't read.
Speaking of the students who can't read, you were still working during a time of transition when many new teachers were coming into the job and into the profession. What do you see ahead for those people who are going to be following in your footsteps?
Well, first of all, my own daughters are all still in education. But what do I see? I certainly see a need for more vocational work. Again, my students in the high school went out to BOCES. I think it's a shame that the high school is offering less and less technical skills. They used to have such wonderful home ec and tech courses, and now they don't have it because of the strict requirements for all the regions. They can't fit these other courses in. And looking at my students, up in Albany, do they know that my students can't read and that it doesn't matter to them, about general knowledge, that they must have practical? Yes.
In as much as your daughters are in the profession and you remember what colleagues were like when we began teaching.
Yes.
And you see this new crop, this new generation. Do you have something in the way of a perspective that you can offer to them about how you see that group of people now?
Well, they're so different. They're so computer literate. And do they read as much as I read? No. Some still do. I can't generalize. My daughters all still read, but they were brought up in a house
Yes, the value reading.
Yes, yes. But
so if you could say read, you
to
could
me,
say that.
yes, that's what I would always say.
Is there any other advice that you could offer young people starting out in the profession?
Well, even though I wasn't active in the union, I really think that they
Really?
should become active in the union, because the way things are going now, they're going to possibly lose tenure. They're going to lose a lot of the wonderful, wonderful benefits, the health benefits, unless they start fighting for them. Uh, they're going to have, they're going to lose them.
We've covered a lifetime. We've talked about a lot of different subjects. What haven't we discussed that you want to make sure is on this record before we conclude?
Well, if my family get a copy of this, I want to tell them how much I love them, how proud I am of each and every one of my daughters, and how I'm looking forward to seeing my grandsons and future grandchildren grow up. And I also want to tell my husband how much I love him and to thank him for the wonderful life he's given me.